St. Paul still and his missionary journeys and all of his nonsense that he's got going on around him. It's all good, right? Okay, well, let's get to it. Thanks for being here. Thanks for sticking with it. I really hope the discussions are good and the packets are good. You guys are feeling like you're learning about the life of the early church and learning from watching the example of St. Paul. So, starts out with sleeping in church, right? That's the main story of the book of Acts. It's a long and venerable tradition we have in the church. It goes back to the New Testament, all right? So, yeah. So if you feel a little sleepy in church, we're
good company.
it's a sign that we're in good company. And yeah, don't lean against the window. That's my advice. All right. So I'm sure you guys talked about this. St. Luke tells us as chapter 20 starts, they get together to break bread, or the breaking of the bread. And of course, that is the New Testament name for the Eucharist. All throughout the Acts of the Apostles, we read about the breaking of the bread, and that is the Eucharist. That's Mass. That's Holy Communion. That's the Lord's Supper that they are getting together to do. And St. Luke tells us that they did this on the first day of the week. Now, we talked about this before. Again, just noticing that's what they are doing. They are getting together to celebrate the Eucharist. Remember, this name has its origin in the story of our Lord's resurrection appearance on the road to Emmaus. If you remember, he's walking with the two disciples. They don't recognize him. He's telling them all the stuff from the Old Testament, how it was pointed to Christ. It's evening time, and he's like, hey, I got to keep going. They're like, no, you got to stay with us. You got to hang out for a minute. And they sit down, and they don't know who he is, and then he breaks the bread, and what does St. Luke tell us? Their eyes are open. They recognize our Lord in the breaking of bread. So St. Luke writes his gospel. He writes that story of the road to Emmaus, and he really wants, in the Acts of the Apostles, every time he refers to the breaking of the bread, he's referring back to that very moment when the risen Lord is recognized on the first Easter night by his disciples when he breaks the bread of the Eucharist. Okay, and it takes us back to that fourfold action that we read over and over again in the New Testament, in the Gospels, that Jesus takes it, he blesses it, he breaks it, and he gives it, right? This is the fourfold action of the Eucharist that we read about in the feeding of the 5,000. We read about again the feeding of the 4,000, and we read about it when he institutes the Eucharist at the Last Supper. And so the breaking of the bread, this is the name for the Eucharist. So they start early in the morning. We know that from historical documents. So they're starting early on Sunday morning. And in this particular instance, they're still going till midnight. All right, so no more complaining. Let's just level set here. All right? Our hour and 10, we got nothing on these guys. Right? If it goes about an hour and 20, you can see people going. They just start leaving and going to the parking lot, walking out. Jeez. So the thing about the early church is, and I say this not to lay it on too thick, but like they believed that what they were doing there was really the most important thing that they could be doing anywhere, right? So it takes as long as it takes. And I know we all got schedules, and I respect schedules, and believe me, I'm all about it too. But the idea is when we are in worship of God on Sunday morning, that's the most important hour and a half, whatever it takes of our whole week, right? Because what we think is, what are we created for? What are we going to spend eternity doing? Worshiping, right? Giving God his due, being in right relationship to him. And so it goes as long as it goes. Now this one, it's ridiculously long, and even St. Luke thinks that, and you can tell that by the way that he tells the story. Because he says, now it went really long because Paul was leaving the next day. So Paul, he had a lot of last minute instructions, that he wants to give, and he did not subscribe to the less is more theory of public speaking, clearly. And so he's going on and on and on. Just one piece of, and I have this up here, one piece of little trivia. Biblical scholars think, based on the way that St. Mark's gospel is written, there aren't kind of little unique sections to it, right? Like one, and then immediately, and then immediately, and then immediately, he keeps saying. And so they think that he wrote it probably for it to be read just in one sitting, which we know the early church did together, right? So when they're there on Sunday morning, they read the entire gospel according to St. Mark. It takes about 3 hours to read out loud. So it tells you something about the expectation that it takes as long as it takes. Again, not trying to suggest that the church service here is going to go on forever and ever and ever, but just by way of comparison, the idea that, hey, when you go past, an hour 10, that's sort of unheard of. We do have in our own way of approaching sermons and things like that, we're not going to go on forever. Some churches, the discipline of the time of sort of staying on time is maybe not quite as much in the forefront of their own approach, but here we are about keeping it moving. Yeah, Mike.
We talked about in our group the Russian Orthodox just goes on and on and on forever, and you're standing up or kneeling on stone floors, and nobody sits down.
Yeah, it's an exercise in repetition too. At some point, like in the Russian Orthodox Church, there's 49 Kyrie eleisons, and then they come back to it 6 more times, and you're going, "Have mercy" is right. Had enough of this. So some of those, yes, it's not uncommon. So longest service of the year here is the Easter Vigil. Some people love it. Some people you couldn't pay them to go to it. And these are some of our very dedicated folks here at St. Lawrence. And that's about 2.5 hours long or something like that. But the tradition was from the earliest days, as they started doing this vigil service, is at sundown they would start reading from the Bible, and they would read from the Bible all night long until dawn. And then they would start the first Eucharist of Easter. And in many places in the Orthodox tradition, they still do that. So if you want to go to a really long church service, I'm sure we can find you one. Okay? All right. Paul's got a lot to say, and he's going for it. And the poor lad on the window, not a great place to sit on a 3rd floor window if you're sleepy, or it's getting late and Paul is preaching. We know that this is 3rd floor, so this is not like a church building like we have here. Remember, we talked about the house churches and all of that. So they're packed in, we're led to believe, and Paul's got a 2nd win or a 3rd win. The guy falls out the window. Now, this actually finally stops the sermon, right? This is the only thing. People dying is the only reason Paul stopped, okay? But then he does something incredible, and I don't know if you guys talked about this in your group, but he's given this rare authority to raise somebody from the dead. This puts him in quite the company here, right? Because only the 2 great prophets of the Old Testament have such an authority, and then of course St. Peter we've read in the Acts of the Apostles just before we switch our attention to Paul, does this very thing. So remember that the main thesis, we said this on opening night of Acts, and we're seeing it play out every single week. The main point of what St. Luke is trying to get us to see is that the ministry of Jesus Christ continues in his church. It continues first through Peter, and then it continues through St. Paul, right? Who has the authority to raise somebody from the dead? Human beings do not, right? Only God has that type of authority over life and death. And what we see is these 2 great figures of the New Testament mirror the 2 great prophets of the Old Testament, Elijah and Elisha, Peter and Paul. But they're continuing the ministry of Jesus Christ. So if you are brain dead from all of the Acts of the Apostles study, and you take nothing away from this, I hope you take away that one sentence, that church continues the ministry of Jesus Christ. Because that's what that informs everything that we are doing here. Anything that we plan, anything, the way that it's all calibrated at St. Lawrence, what we think we're doing, the reason we stress tradition and continuity and apostolic teaching and all the rest of the stuff we do, the clothes we wear, the songs we sing, all of it is based on that belief that the church is continuing the ministry of Jesus Christ in our own day, right? So it doesn't just stop. It's not a museum. It's not a time to get together and think about somebody who lived a long time ago and say nice things about Jesus who lived a long time ago. There are a lot of churches that's kind of their way of thinking about church. That's not the way St. Lawrence is organized, and I think you can see that. I hope you can see that we think we're continuing the ministry of Jesus Christ among us. Paul then goes to Ephesus, and he's got an address that he gives to the bishops and to the priests there. We cover this in the packet. That the Greek words, sometimes Bibles translate as overseer or elder, and we got all those translations squared out for you in the packet. But the distinction between priest and bishop and all that is not quite so clear. The ministry is definitely in development at this stage of the church's life. But I think it's notable what he says to these church leaders that he gathers in Ephesus, because he gives them just two directions, really. Be on guard for yourselves, and then be on guard for all the flock. And what he's saying first is, it's critical. You have to sort of look after your own. If you're going to lead anybody, you got to try to at least practice what you're going to preach, right? You got to be on guard for yourself. So if you have any, and everyone in the room, by the way, does have some type of spiritual authority, because you have a relationship with some other Christian, right? So whether you're a father or a brother or a sister or a daughter or whatever, if you have a relationship with some other Christian, you yourself need to really pay attention to these two directions that Paul is giving, because what he says to the church leaders, it applies to all Christians in their own realm of authority. So it applies to lay and ordained alike. You got to look after your own interior life if you're going to at all attempt to try to lead someone else, right? So if you've got a son or a daughter or a grandson or a granddaughter and you care anything about their faith, and I know everybody in the room, or a niece or a nephew, everybody in the room has this as part of their life, and they do care about the spiritual development of their son, their daughter, their niece, their nephew, their grandson, whatever. This is a critical piece of advice, and it's so simple, and yet it's something that absolutely cannot be overlooked. We have to look after our interior life and our own discipleship and our own walk with Jesus Christ, our own learning and spiritual growth, if we're going to attempt to guide someone else. Full stop, right? You can't guide others. You can't ask others to do that which you're unwilling to do. John Chrysostom, or Chrysostom, depending on if you want to sound fake British. So John Chrysostom, he says, this is not because our own salvation is more precious than that of the flock, but because when we attend to ourselves, the flock also benefits. So he's talking about, just not like, hey, I look out for number one and forget everybody else, but no, like I look out for number one so that I can look out for number two. It's the put your own mask on first so you can put the mask on. Everybody knows that, right? Because we all have to sit there and watch it every time the plane's about to take off. Or we watched Tommy Boy when he gets on the plane and it does that. Y'all remember that? That's maybe too random. There's a movie Tommy Boy, Chris Farley, he sneaks on the plane. Isn't that Tommy Boy?
It is.
Yes. Thank you. Well, okay. I thought I was going crazy there for a minute. If you want to watch the stupidest movie and you want to become dumber after having become smarter tonight, watch Tommy Boy. It's a lot of fun. Just brain dead movie. It's fun. Okay. the point is, look after yourself so that you can look after others. And there's this sincere, what does our Lord say, right? Love your neighbor as yourself, right? So self-love is part of it, right? And then love of neighbor, these two things go together. Paul, in this address, he has some other warnings that are just worth noting, and some of the language he uses, which are similar to the language our Lord uses when he's talking in John chapter 10 about how he's the good shepherd. And he says, of course, the wolves will come and tear up the sheep. So he says, savage wolves are coming, and men, we're going to rise up. Even within the ranks of the church, he's saying, here at Ephesus, they're going to rise up here in Ephesus, at your church. This is going to happen, and they will distort the truth. And so what we watch with great sadness around us, Christian leaders, doing this. We don't love it, but what we are reminded is this is not a new thing. Okay, so from the very first days of the church, there is this temptation of church leaders to kind of take authority for themselves that doesn't really belong to them, and to distort the truth into whatever version of the truth they want to repackage and sell it as. And there's lots of different motivations of why people want to do that, but sadly, that is an age-old temptation for Christian leaders. Part of the reason that the apostolic nature of the church is critical to our understanding what's true and what's not true, we want to test it against the witness of the apostles. And if I were to ask you where you're going to find the witness of the apostles, where would you want to go look? Where are you going to find the witness of the apostles?
Jesus.
Again, so the New Testament, right? That's what the New Testament is. That's why we have it, right? So, well, one of the things like we want to be able to do is to sort of say what is in the New Testament and how was it interpreted from the very beginning, right? This is a critical way to navigate and to duck and weave what's true and not true. And somebody can tell you, well, I mean, look, I picked this quote, out of the New Testament, and here's what it means. And you have to be able to sort of do some research on that and say, like, is that really what it means? The interpretation of the New Testament has to be filtered through the apostolic tradition, right? The witness of those who have taught the church from the very beginning. Of course, the apostolic, the dissemination of truth, right? And this is what Jesus says is, what the Father has taught me, now I teach you. So the Father to the Son, to the apostles. So this is the way we get to the teaching of Jesus is through his apostles. It's probably the reason we say in the Nicene Creed we believe in one holy Catholic and apostolic church. What's an apostolic church, right? A church that's founded on the witness of the apostles. Okay? And then Paul points to his own example that he's given in this farewell address. He talks about how he's lived among them and you should do as I have done. And he says in this farewell address, this is the only quote, if you want like a fun little trivia, thing where people will be like, oh, wow, that's good trivia. Is more blessed to give than to receive. This is the only quote, he attributes that quote to Jesus, but we don't find it in the Gospels. So it's the only quote in the New Testament that we don't find in the Gospels that is from Jesus. Now, of course, it's very much in line with, it's a very Jesus thing to say, right? We all can get that very much in line. But, we find this great paradox in the Christian life that when we serve others and we build others up, this really blesses us, that in feeding others we get fed. And I don't know if you guys have heard this little allegory of the long spoons. I think I talked about this in a sermon before, but this idea of, that this guy gets this visit to heaven and he gets a visit to hell. And the two look virtually identical. There's a great banquet and great spread, and there's sumptuous foods and wine and everything. The table is spread, and the people in hell are cranky and angry and frustrated, and the people in heaven are laughing and joyful and full and well fed. And the difference is the spoon is long, right? The utensils given are long, and the only way you can be fed in heaven is you have to feed someone else. It won't reach to feed your own mouth. The people in hell can't figure it out, right? So focused on themselves, so focused on being served rather than serving others, that this leads to their, frustration for all eternity, right? And so the joy of heaven, then, in this way that this person imagines it in this allegory of the long spoons, is we discover it in this life, the joy of serving others rather than it all being about number one and everyone in the world exists because it revolves around me, right? The whole thing. We understand that our Lord, says that He's the one who came to serve rather than to be served. So it's a beautiful image of the different, and just the small difference between heaven and hell being the long spoon versus the short spoon, which greatly changes your disposition towards others. And how do you see people in life, and how, when you talk to people and encounter people, do you see them as people who need to be built up, people who need love, or are they just kind of a means to an end for you? So it really changes the way you see people. He heads to Jerusalem. This is where we're going to end. This is the last slide. In St. Luke's Gospel, when Jesus heads to Jerusalem, this is kind of the turning point. He sets his face towards Jerusalem. And what St. Luke is telling us in Luke 9:51 is that Jesus is a man on a mission. And he's using this, again, the same author, right? So when we're reading Acts, we just want to compare it back to Luke because it's the same author. And he's using this image of our Lord as a man on a mission heading to Jerusalem. He's using the same image for St. Paul, right? He's heading towards Jerusalem. Interestingly enough, the disciples of Paul are saying, don't do it, don't do it, don't do it, don't go there. They're going to take you out, which is exactly what the disciples of Jesus are saying in the gospel. Don't do it, they're going to take you out. So Paul is intentionally Luke is intentionally portraying Paul as a very similar Christ-like figure as he's heading towards Jerusalem. His mission, of course, is the imitation of Christ. We just said this, and this is a quote from 1 Corinthians, be imitators of me as I am of Christ. And, I was just going to leave you with this. If you're looking for like a devotional book to read, there's this classic Christian work, probably one of the most read Christian works of all time, besides the Bible, The Imitation of Christ by this guy, Thomas Kimball. It contains a lot of simple spiritual wisdom in it, and you can buy it on Amazon, and you can probably get it for free online if you don't want to buy it on Amazon. But just the idea that the Christian life is very much to imitate Jesus Christ. And so it sounds simple, but it proves to be a lifetime worth of trying. Okay, well, I hope that was helpful to everybody. If y'all will stand, we'll have a prayer. And if you have a second,